For the past decade, organisations have really been struggling with a very uncomfortable position. With the rising complexity of technology and their digital footprint and the increased working remotely now and the changes to their operating environment, coupled together with the increasing threats and the cyber attacks that they're facing as an organisation, it's becoming virtually impossible to understand the true risks to their organisation. But also, I think the security industry hasn't done a good job of communicating. It tends to be a very broad conversation, and I think because of that, organisations have struggled to understand the information they're being told. So, in my talk today, I'm going to be talking about how can you improve communication and visibility of the cyber risk of an organisation, and how can you have different conversations with the different people in your organisation who need different messages. It's not just about the board, it's about every level in your organisation. For years, those of us in the technology areas have been told we talk a different language to the rest of the organisation. We talk in technical terms and we talk in detail. And especially when that comes to cyber risk, where we see the scale and the complexity of the threats that organisations are facing today are becoming overwhelming. But as we try and communicate those to our executive so that they can truly understand the level of risk that they're facing as an organisation, it's getting harder and harder to unpick that complexity and communicate it in a way that boards can actually make decisions on. Because I think historically we haven't done a good job. What we've tended to trot out is an escalating conversation around cyber risk, because I think each time we felt that the board didn't quite understand the message we were trying to give them, we escalated out. We made the problem bigger. We've made the problem seem so incredibly overwhelming for organisations that actually it's hard for them to see what they're actually supposed to do about it. But equally, I think as it's communicated through the press, we see the large compromises out in the commercial world in these big organisations. And they're the ones that we focus on. They're the big cyber risks that we focus on. But the reality is that 95% of all cyber incidents have a people component. It's very rare in real terms for an organisation to actually be hacked by a hacker. The majority of compromises are, misconfiguration of databases that allow public access, those sorts of things. And actually, by not communicating some of these basic elements, we're missing out on actually fixing some of the nuts and bolts of an organisation that would have far more impact than worrying about the billion-dollar compromise of a big commercial organisation. So today, actually, I'm going to talk about how do you actually get an organisation back to basics, to think about some of those basic vulnerabilities that they have, where they can actually make some conscious decisions on their own and actually do something about. Now, one of the elements I think that is important is that when we talk about these big compromises of commercial organisation, the billion-dollar figures start bandied about, and we start to put those sorts of numbers on the cost of a compromise. Now, when you start to communicate that with your own organisation, the immediate response is, well, we're not a billion-dollar organisation, so how does that apply to me? And it's actually quite hard for us to translate from that large commercial compromise down to something more meaningful, the board. But actually, numbers like that are very important. They're a fundamental component in how we talk about cyber risk. So actually, it's quite important that we have a mechanism to translate and communicate those effectively. Now, cost in those ways is made up of a number of different elements. It might be the cost of detection and the escalation of that incident. It might be the cost of actually dealing with all of those people that have their privacy compromised through this exploit that's happened in your organisation. It might be going around knocking on doors. It might be actually apologising in person because of the event that's happened. But these have a cost to an organisation. And I think when you understand that true cost to your organisation, you can then start to put a dollar figure on it. One of the basic compromises we see quite often is people emailing spreadsheets to the wrong person. Email of spreadsheets is still a way that a lot of organisations move data around. So that sort of compromise is quite commonplace. Now, the cost of that, you would argue, is the detection and cleanup is limited, but actually going around and dealing with all of those people that have had their privacy compromised, dealing with the reputational damage and all those other aspects actually has a dollar figure to it. And it's those dollar figures that are quite important to understand. So IBM has done a whole bunch of work around this, and because of that, they've been able to look at what is the per user cost of a compromise. So rather than looking at it saying the average cost of a compromise in organizations is $4 million for cleanup and all of those other things, getting down to the nitty gritty of saying if you've compromised the privacy of one person, this is the average dollar value of that compromise. And from there, you can actually then start to look at the dollar value of controlling email better. Not letting people email spreadsheets around, because you've actually got a pure financial basis for solving that problem. Now, some of these figures, I've got it in the slides here, but actually it's not static for everything. So dependent on what sort of industry or organization you're involved in, the cost basis is different. So from here you will see that the cost from a health compromise, because of the sensitivity of the area and the challenge that can be presented if you've actually compromised the privacy of somebody in a health environment, the cost of that is considerably higher than some of the public sector context, where actually the compromise there is seen can be less severe. But also, I think you look at this scale, the public sector also includes health and education and some of those other higher cost areas. So I think I wouldn't take this as straight. I think it's worth looking at it in your own organization and getting this sort of approach where you can look at the per user basis of a compromise in your organization. But I think the bigger picture is, how do you build a security metrics program around your risk profile? So actually you can talk to an organization through data, and you can link things through data rather than having a very subjective conversation purely linked around dollar value and things like that. I think it's important to put things in the right context for people and to get a level of detail that they actually understand for themselves in their own context. So building a metrics program is quite important. Metrics also lead to improvement. It's not the other way around. You don't naturally improve because you've got a metric program. But actually, having those metrics in place allow you to have a conversation that drives an improvement activity. So without a metrics program or without this communication, how are you actually focusing, prioritizing, and actually looking to improve in your organization? But one of the important things, I think, when we think about the translation service is taking a portfolio-based approach. So for those of you in the non-technical world, you're probably familiar with this really just from a business impact analysis around disaster recovery and those sorts of things potentially. But the basic concept of a service portfolio is understanding what are the business outcomes and what are the business things that we deliver. What are the parts of the organization that deliver those, and who are the people involved and their skills and capability, and what are the tools and technology that they use to deliver those. By linking all those things together, you get a richer picture, and actually you can start to put things in true context for people. Because I think, one of the communication challenges I've seen in organizations, and you might all be familiar with these sorts of things, is when you get that email on a Friday afternoon that says server XYZ is going to be down for the weekend because we're doing patching and maintenance, things like that. And I think the natural response from everybody is, well, what the hell's server XYZ and why should I care? People think about the technology they access. They don't think about what server it sits on, what network it's connected to. They think about the thing that they log into and they interact with on a daily basis. So the service portfolio allows you to translate not from a server name, but actually to something that a business person that uses that service will actually understand. What that then starts to enable you to think about is the stories that you can tell around cyber that will translate it into something relevant for the person that's using that service. Now this is actually quite a good mechanism, I think, because what you can then start to bring into this is the examples from the real world and how they apply in your environment. So rather than just an abstract we could be subject to so many different phishing attacks, and this is how it works. You can actually walk through a scenario of an effective phishing attack in the real world, and how would it play out in your organization. This might be a ransomware attack, it might be an exploit around fraudulent financial transactions, or just spoofing somebody through that mechanism, or trying to get credentials, those sorts of things. But it gives you a range of options to talk about cyber risk from a personal context of the individual through a story in their organization. Now, linking that to the service portfolio, you can then start to identify what risks are actually relevant to what parts of an organization. And again, this is very important, because if you're talking about risk that isn't relevant for the person, the eyes will glaze over and they'll go, well, so what? What's it got to do with me? So these storytelling elements are quite important, and telling these stories through data actually enable you to have a rich conversation with people. The other part of the conversation is how do you make this visual for people? And now cyber risk is one of those areas actually where you sometimes don't want to be so public around the risks that you're facing. Ultimately, understanding your risk could give an exploiter or an attacker a mechanism to exploit your network. So you don't necessarily want to tell them exactly where your vulnerabilities are. But using techniques like Gemba board and those sorts of elements to really make it visual for people so they can understand allows you to translate some of your information and your data into something more relevant for people. So in this context, it might be in your technical area, you might have data up there around patching levels, amount of legacy in the environment, and some of these different technical challenges. When you get into the business area, it might be something you're talking about, phishing emails and those sorts of other statistics that you can actually make visual for people. But it's actually part of this translation service where you start to talk to different parts of the organization in a different way that makes it relevant for them. Then when you can get to the board level, rather than talking about an abstract risk, you can actually start to talk about specific compromises that have occurred out in the real world. Because I think sometimes risk gets distilled down to such an abstract level that it's just too generalized and it's too vague to try and understand. By making it specific around the services that you have, you can actually start to communicate in a way that's relevant to the board so that they can actually understand it. And here we've got a couple of examples of compromises that occurred out in the real world. So you can actually target those specifically to this risk is relevant for this area of the organization. Our exposure to this particular risk is high, medium, low, based on the data that we have available to us. It makes it far more contextual and far more relevant to a board member who can actually visualize and actually can go away and read up on the compromise and what occurred, and actually put it in their own personal mind and get it straight in their head. So it's not just a cybersecurity professional coming up saying you've got this really bad technical risk. They can actually go and read the news, they can read more detail and actually understand a little bit more about the threat. Because ultimately we are faced with a growing curve. Now, this looks a scary graph because it actually shows the number of vulnerabilities and what's happening in the environment is just going up constantly. One word of caution, I think, when we see graphs like this is that there was a program a number of years ago, actually at the start of this curve, where software companies started to put bug bounties out. They started to pay people to find vulnerabilities. And because of that, we've seen a growth because there's money in it. There's actually, you can earn a living finding security vulnerabilities in software. And I think a lot of that has drove this growth in vulnerabilities in software that we see. The reality is the number of exploits that we see is a relatively static number. It is going up, but it's certainly not exponentially growing as we're seeing today. And people are being compromised not necessarily from a highly sophisticated zero-day, but they do happen. They're being compromised for something that was patched 2 to 3 years ago. Certainly when we're seeing a lot of the software events and the ransomware events and things like that, they're not necessarily targeting the 0-day. They're actually targeting organizations that didn't patch their Windows XP box that they've still got sat underneath somebody's desk. And they're the organizations that are getting caught out. So not focusing too much on this escalation picture, but actually thinking more about what's relevant for you and how do you actually keep your own system safe, and stop talking about some of these real escalation and scary diagrams. So how do you get started? I think one of the things is to think about your vulnerabilities in your network and how you actually gain visibility of that. Because while it's a fairly abstract conversation about risk, it's actually quite hard to understand. So starting to bring in some vulnerability scanning capabilities and those other things that can provide you a metric and visibility over your network will actually give you a good starting point. The good thing about some of these tools and techniques as well is they can provide you with an aggregate score. And aggregation is good as you move up in an organization. So yes, if you've got highly critical vulnerabilities in your network where you've got an exploit in the wild, they will come up as a critical vulnerability, and yes, they've got to be dealt with. But actually, how do you keep prioritizing and how do you keep going? Using something like an aggregated vulnerability score will give you a target, an executive strategic target that you can actually go after as an organization. And you can use that as the measure and the conversation point rather than just a very broad and open conversation. So looking at that, and I think again, a word of caution as you bring these capabilities in, when you first implement a vulnerability scanning tool or any sort of scanning tool in your environment, what you will find is a highly vulnerable environment because you've never had visibility before. It's suddenly you're lifting up the cover on your network, and where you've relied on individuals to try and keep it safe, but individuals have a number of other challenges that they're facing every single day and a number of other things that they worry about on a day-to-day basis. So actually enabling them through these sorts of technology enable those people to focus on what's important as well. So when you first implement, you will see a lot of vulnerabilities, and unfortunately I think sometimes when you see that, the messenger gets shot in the foot, and it becomes a little bit of a cultural issue in an organization. But take a step back from that, because what they've just enabled is true visibility into your network. What you can then start to do is prioritize what are the most important things, and then you start the continual improvement cycle where you can start to pick off what are the most important vulnerabilities in our network and how do we start to eliminate them. It's how do you eat an elephant, and one bite at a time is important when it comes to cyber risk, because we're facing that escalating curve all the time. So if you get into that mindset that you've got to constantly fight for every single vulnerability and deal with everything, you're going to be overwhelmed. There's no chance that you're actually going to be able to focus. And if you can focus on what are the most important critical vulnerabilities in your environment, that will enable you to start to improve and deal with it. And it will also enable you to communicate to the rest of the organization about what you're working on to improve your security profile as an organization and why it's important to them and how they can help. That's just a few pointers around communicating cyber risk to an organization. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on digital transformation, subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for listening today.